Hi everyone, for this video I'm going to show you your next steps after you have completed sewing your collar. So I've got my collar right here. The next step is you want to sew your facing pieces, your front facing pieces onto your other back yoke. So one of your back yokes that you cut was what you attached to the back piece. So your second back yoke that you've cut, you will line up with your two front facing pieces. So right side will be touching right side, and you're going to line these up along the shoulder. These will be your shoulder seams, and this is where your necklines all match up. So this is the back of your neck, and then these two curves from your front facing, those go around the front of the neck. So your front facing is not as wide as your back yoke. So you're just going to line it up to where the necklines match up. And you're going to sew at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you will do that on both ends. So just line it up to where the edge of the neck curve meets, and then sew at 1/2 inch seam allowance. And remember that your facing pieces are fused. After you've sewn your facing pieces to your back yoke, you are ready to attach your collar. So your collar gets sandwiched in between these pieces and this piece that you've sewn together that has your fronts sewn to your back yoke and your back. So think of it as a sandwich. This is one piece of bread, this is your other piece of bread, and this is the meat and cheese that goes in the middle. So to lay this out, take your, using pins. So to lay this out, take your large piece here that has your back and your fronts attached. You're going to lay it out to where you can see the neckline of your piece. Take your collar and you're going to line up the edges of the back neck with the edge of your collar, and make sure that your undercollar is the one that has the understitching on it. Make sure that that side is face down, touching your back yoke right here. So this is what you see up here. This is your top collar. This is your undercollar. So undercollar is laying and touching the back piece. And now you're going to line up your notches and pin around your neck. So I'm finding my double notch on my collar, and I'm lining that up with the double notches on my back yoke. That shows you where those double notches are. That's the center back. You also have 2 notches on the side of your collar, or on this end, you have 2 notches a little further out. Those notches line up with your shoulder seam where your back yoke attaches to your front piece. So line up that notch with your shoulder seam. Final notches you have to line up is this notch that's about 1 inch. It might be 1 1/4 inch, but it's 1 inch to 1 1/4 inch in from the edge of your front. That notch is where you will line up the edge of your finished collar. So that part is very important. Make sure the edge of your collar is on that notch. It's not at the very edge of your front piece. Okay, I've got all of those notches pinned. Another thing I want to make sure of is that my plaid is matching up. So I'm going to turn this around so you can see I've pinned it, but you want to make sure that your plaid patterns are matching from your back yoke up onto your under collar. So if you need to put extra pins in, go ahead and do that. I'm going to put a few extra pins using these red lines on my fabric as points where I'm trying to get my fabric to match up on this seam. After you have pinned this in place, you can sew all along this bottom edge of the collar. You will sew all of this together at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have finished sewing my collar onto my back and front panels. And now I'm going to attach my back yoke and my facing pieces. So remember that this is a sandwich. So we've got our bread, we've got our meat and cheese in the middle, which is our collar. Now time to put the other piece of bread on. So for this one, you will line up the necklines with the edge of the neckline right here where that collar was sewn on. Make sure right sides are touching right sides. So I would suggest starting with your notches that are showing the center back of your yoke. Match up those double notches with the double notches of your collar and the other back yoke that's sewn on to your back piece. And then from there, start to pin outwards along the neckline. So next I'm going to my shoulder seams, making sure that my shoulder seams where my back yoke attaches to my facing piece, making sure that shoulder seam is lining up with the notch of my collar and the other shoulder seam where the other back yoke piece is attached to the front panels. And then next, this straight side of your facing, move this out a little bit. So here's your front facing piece. You've got your curved edge, which is your neckline, and then this straight part, which is this extension on your front. So this curve, where this curve turns the corner and then begins that straight edge, that matches up with the straight edge of your front piece. Okay, I've pinned one side from the center back to the end of that neckline. I'm going to pin the other side. Again, matching my shoulder seams. And then matching the edge of my facing with the straight edge of my front piece. Okay, I have pinned all of that together. I'm going to go back over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew this again at 1/4 inch. Right, I have sewn now my back yoke and facing pieces along that neckline edge at 1/4 inch. If I lift up my back yoke, you can see my collar sandwiched in between them now. So when you turn this right side out, now you have the outside of your top where your collar is and your back, and then if you look at the inside of the top, you've got your back yoke and your facing pieces. Now we want to understitch the seam allowance right here. We want to keep that to where it's, we want to keep the seam allowance that you had just sewn that 1/4 inch at. You want to keep that seam allowance tacked on to the inside of the top, not the outside. So the same way you would understitch a collar, I'm going to stitch a 1/8 inch stitch. So 1/8 inch from this seam between your collar and your back yoke, stitch 1/8 of an inch down, and you're tacking this back yoke to this seam allowance right here. So you'll put it under your sewing machine like this. Here's your collar, here's your back yoke, there are your facing pieces. So just stitch 1/8 inch down from this seam, and that 1/8 inch stitch is going to connect this back yoke to this seam allowance under here. And you're going to do that all the way from the edge of this facing piece just along this seam all the way to this other side of the other facing piece. I've finished my understitch. So that is 1/8 of an inch down from the seam, or the stitch is 1/8 of an inch down from this seam where my collar attaches to my back yoke. All right, now you want to attach your edge of your facing to the edge of your front piece. So to do that, we want right sides to touch right sides when we sew. So take your front facing piece, wrap it back so that you can have right sides touching right sides. So you're gonna just line that up. And then you're going to sew that together just down this edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you'll do that on both sides. Okay. I've sewn my facing onto my top at this edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. I'm going to understitch this. So if you lay it out, you want to press your seam allowance towards your facing piece. So seam allowance is pressed towards the facing, and then you're going to stitch the seam allowance down onto the facing with a stitch that's 1/8 of an inch away from this seam that you just did. Okay, I have finished understitching my facing. So you can see this is the seam line right here where my facing is attached to my front piece, and here's my stitch line, my understitching line. So that has tacked this seam allowance down onto the facing piece to just help it to stay in place. So then make sure you poke out your corners of its edge. You might have to clip inside there so that the bulk is not as much. And you do that for both sides. Okay, so that is attaching the collar and your facing and other back yoke piece. So it should look like this so far. I know it's not really attached the rest of the shoulder. Don't worry about that right now. We'll do that in another video. But this is what it should look like. And here is the outside of your shirt.